The sound of classical music floating through the executive floor of Sterling Financial Tower at midnight should have been impossible. Marcus Sterling, the 42-year-old founder and CEO of Sterling Investment Group, stood frozen outside the elevator on the 42nd floor, his Italian leather briefcase hanging loose in his grip. He had returned to retrieve some forgotten contracts, expecting the building to be empty save for the overnight security guard. Instead, haunting melodies of what sounded like Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major drifted through the marble corridors like a ghost from another world. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus followed the sound with growing irritation. Someone was using his company's grand piano without permission. The Steinway Model D concert grand, worth more than most people's annual salaries, had been his late father's prized possession, moved from the family estate to the executive conference room as both a memorial and a symbol of the Sterling family's refined taste. It was strictly off-limits to everyone except for the rare occasions when Marcus hosted high-profile clients who might appreciate such cultural sophistication. The idea that some unauthorized person was treating it like a common instrument filled him with indignation. As he rounded the corner toward the conference room, Marcus prepared to deliver a sharp reprimand to whoever had the audacity to trespass on his property. Through the glass doors, he could see a figure hunched over the keyboard, completely absorbed in the music. The man wore the navy blue uniform of the building's janitorial staff, his gray hair catching the soft light from the piano lamp. Marcus's jaw tightened with disgust. Not only was someone playing his piano without permission, but it was merely the janitor, a member of the cleaning crew who had no business touching something so valuable and refined. Marcus burst through the conference room doors with enough force to make them slam against the walls. The music stopped abruptly as the janitor's hands jerked away from the keys, his weathered face turning toward the interruption with startled eyes. The man appeared to be in his late 50s, with calloused hands and the tired posture of someone who spent his nights mopping floors and emptying trash bins. His name tag read Roberto Mendez, though Marcus had never bothered to learn the names of the building's service staff. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Marcus's voice echoed through the spacious room, sharp and accusatory. "This is a $300,000 concert piano, not some toy for the help to play with." Roberto slowly stood from the bench, his movements careful and apologetic. "Mr. Sterling, I am so sorry. I was just finishing my work on this floor, and I heard the piano calling to me. I meant no disrespect. I will leave immediately." His accent was slight but noticeable, suggesting English was not his first language, and his tone carried the practiced deference of someone accustomed to apologizing for his mere existence in spaces like this. "Calling to you," Marcus repeated with a harsh laugh. "What kind of ridiculous nonsense is that? This instrument is worth more than you'll make in 5 years. Do you have any idea what kind of damage you could cause with those rough hands of yours?" The janitor's face flushed with embarrassment, but he maintained his dignity despite the humiliation. "I understand your concern, Mr. Sterling. I was very careful. I have been playing piano since I was a child in my country. I would never harm such a beautiful instrument." Marcus scoffed at the claim, his prejudices fully activated. "Playing piano? You're a janitor. You clean toilets and empty garbage cans. What could someone like you possibly know about classical music or proper piano technique?" The cruelty in his words was intentional, designed to put this man back in what Marcus considered his proper place in the social hierarchy. "I studied at the conservatory in my homeland," Roberto said quietly, his voice steady despite the obvious pain Marcus's words had caused. "Music was my life before circumstances brought me here." "Circumstances?" Marcus repeated mockingly. "Right. Well, your circumstances now involve staying away from my piano. Consider this your only warning. If I find you near this instrument again, you'll be looking for new circumstances of employment." 3 weeks passed before Marcus encountered Roberto again, though not by choice. The Sterling Investment Group was hosting its annual Investor Appreciation Dinner, a prestigious event designed to strengthen relationships with the firm's wealthiest clients. The guest list included Fortune 500 executives, old money families, and international financiers, all gathered in the building's elegant reception hall on the 40th floor. Marcus had spent months planning every detail, from the catered menu by the city's most exclusive chef to the string quartet that provided sophisticated background music throughout the evening. The dinner was progressing flawlessly until Marcus noticed a disruption near the service area. Several guests had gathered around something that was clearly drawing their attention away from the carefully orchestrated networking opportunities. Annoyed by the distraction, Marcus excused himself from a conversation with the Japanese delegation and moved toward the commotion to address whatever was interrupting his event. As he approached, Marcus could hear animated voices discussing someone's unexpected talent. "Absolutely extraordinary," Mrs. Pemberton, the widow of a steel magnate, was saying to her companion. "I haven't heard technique like that since I attended the Vienna Philharmonic." The woman beside her nodded enthusiastically, adding that whoever was responsible deserved recognition in more appropriate venues. Marcus pushed through the small crowd, his irritation mounting as he realized that his carefully planned evening was being derailed by some unauthorized entertainment. When he finally saw what had captured everyone's attention, his blood began to boil. There, in the corner near the service entrance, stood Roberto Mendez, still wearing his janitorial uniform, his work cart positioned nearby. The man was speaking softly with several of Marcus's most important clients, his posture respectful but no longer apologetic. "What's going on here?" Marcus demanded, his voice cutting through the admiring chatter of his guests. The group turned toward him, their expressions ranging from curious to slightly uncomfortable at his obvious displeasure. Dr. Harrison Blackwell, a prominent neurologist and one of Marcus's largest investors, spoke up first. "Marcus, you didn't tell us you had such remarkable talent working in your building." This gentleman was just explaining the complex mathematical relationships in Bach's compositions. Fascinating insights into the intersection of music and cognitive science. Marcus felt his face flush with embarrassment and anger. The last thing he needed was for his sophisticated clientele to discover that he employed people who could discuss subjects typically reserved for educated circles. It disrupted the careful social boundaries he worked to maintain, boundaries that reinforced his position at the top of the hierarchy. "Dr. Blackwell, I think there's been some misunderstanding," Marcus said, his tone diplomatically controlled despite his inner fury. "Roberto here is part of our maintenance staff. I'm sure he needs to return to his duties." The dismissal was clear, intended to remind everyone present of the man's proper place in the building's social structure. But Roberto didn't immediately retreat as Marcus expected. Instead, he looked directly at Marcus with something new in his eyes, a quiet strength that hadn't been there during their previous encounter. "Mr. Sterling, your guests were asking about the piano in the conference room. They heard someone playing earlier and were curious about who it might have been." The admission hit Marcus like a physical blow. His guests had heard Roberto playing his father's piano, and instead of being scandalized by the impropriety, they were impressed by the performance. This was exactly the kind of situation Marcus had been trying to prevent, a blurring of the lines between the help and the clientele that could undermine his authority. "I see," Marcus said stiffly. "Well, I'm sure our guests are more interested in discussing their portfolios than maintenance schedules." He turned to address the group, hoping to redirect their attention to more appropriate topics, but Mrs. Pemberton interrupted him. "Actually, Marcus, we were hoping to hear this young man play. Several of us are quite passionate about classical music, and it's so rare to encounter genuine talent in unexpected places." Her tone carried the authority of someone accustomed to having her wishes accommodated, putting Marcus in an impossible position. Other voices joined in agreement, and Marcus realized that refusing their request would create more disruption than allowing it. He found himself trapped between his desire to maintain social boundaries and his need to please his most valuable clients. The situation was spiraling beyond his control, threatening to expose the prejudices that guided his worldview. "I'm sure Roberto needs to focus on his work responsibilities," Marcus said, making one last attempt to end the situation gracefully. "Perhaps we could arrange for some appropriate entertainment at a future event." "Oh, nonsense," Dr. Blackwell interjected. "Surely the man can spare a few minutes to share his gift. We're all quite curious now, aren't we?" He looked around the group, receiving enthusiastic nods and murmurs of agreement from the assembled guests. Roberto stood quietly during this exchange, neither pushing himself forward nor backing away. His dignity in the face of Marcus's obvious discomfort was remarkable, suggesting a strength of character that Marcus had never bothered to notice. When the pressure from the guests became undeniable, Marcus found himself in the humiliating position of having to request something from a man he had so recently insulted. "Fine," Marcus said through gritted teeth. "Roberto, if you're willing to play something brief for our guests, I suppose that would be acceptable." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The words tasted bitter in his mouth, but he had no choice if he wanted to maintain harmony with his clients. Roberto nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "I would be honored to play for your guests, Mr. Sterling. Would the conference room be appropriate?" His question was respectful, but carried an undertone that suggested he understood exactly what this request was costing Marcus's pride. The group began moving toward the conference room with an excitement that Marcus found deeply unsettling. His carefully controlled evening was transforming into something unpredictable, something that challenged the social order he had spent years establishing. As they walked, Marcus could hear his guests discussing their anticipation, their expectations raised by the brief glimpse of Roberto's knowledge they had already witnessed. The conference room had never felt smaller to Marcus than it did. As 20 of his most important clients filed in, their attention focused entirely on the man in the janitor's uniform approaching the Steinway. The contrast between Roberto's working clothes and the elegant surroundings seemed to emphasize everything that Marcus found troubling about the situation. This was not how things were supposed to work in his world. Roberto approached the piano bench with a reverence that Marcus couldn't help but notice. The man's weathered hands hovered over the keys for a moment, as if he were greeting an old friend he hadn't seen in too long. When he finally began to play, Marcus expected to hear the fumbling attempts of someone with basic skills, something that would quickly satisfy his guest's curiosity and allow him to resume control of his evening. Instead, what filled the room was music of such breathtaking beauty and technical mastery that Marcus felt his cynicism crumble within the first few measures. Roberto's fingers moved across the keys with the precision of a surgeon and the grace of a dancer, coaxing sounds from the instrument that Marcus had never heard before, despite owning it for over a decade. The piece was Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, one of the most technically demanding works in the classical repertoire, and Roberto was performing it with the skill of a world-class virtuoso. The music transformed the corporate conference room into a concert hall, each note resonating with emotional depth that spoke to something profound in the human experience. Marcus watched his guests, their faces reflecting a range of emotions from wonder to tears, completely transported by the performance unfolding before them. Mrs. Pemberton had closed her eyes, swaying slightly with the melody, while Dr. Blackwell leaned forward in his chair, studying Roberto's technique with obvious admiration. As the piece progressed, Marcus found himself forgetting his anger and embarrassment, drawn into the music despite his resistance. Roberto's performance wasn't just technically perfect, it was emotionally devastating, telling a story of loss and hope, struggle and triumph that resonated in ways that mere words never could. The man's entire being seemed to flow through his fingertips, revealing depths of artistry that challenged everything Marcus thought he knew about talent, class, and human worth. When Roberto finally played the last notes, the silence that followed was profound and reverent. For several heartbeats, no one moved or spoke, as if breaking the spell would diminish what they had just experienced. Then, slowly, the applause began. It started with Mrs. Pemberton, then spread through the room until every person was standing, their appreciation genuine and overwhelming. "Magnificent," Dr. Blackwell declared, his voice filled with awe. "Simply magnificent. Roberto, where did you train?" That was conservatory-level performance, possibly beyond what most conservatories could produce. Roberto stood from the piano bench, his humble demeanor unchanged despite the extraordinary performance he had just delivered. "Thank you for your kindness. I studied at the National Conservatory in Buenos Aires before coming to this country. Music has always been the language of my heart, even when life required me to speak other languages to survive." The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. Roberto wasn't just a janitor who happened to play piano. He was a professionally trained musician whose circumstances had forced him into menial labor. The man Marcus had mocked and dismissed was more accomplished in his field than Marcus was in his own, possessing skills and artistry that money couldn't buy and education couldn't guarantee. "Buenos Aires Conservatory," Mrs. Pemberton repeated with obvious respect. "That's one of South America's premier institutions. Roberto, what brought you here? Surely someone with your talent could find opportunities in the music world." Roberto's expression grew distant, tinged with a sadness that suggested painful memories. "Sometimes life makes choices for us, Mrs. Pemberton. My wife became very ill, and the medical expenses in Argentina were beyond our reach. We came here hoping for better health care, but her condition was already too advanced. After she passed, I found myself alone in a country where my credentials meant nothing, where starting over meant taking whatever work I could find to survive." The room fell silent as the weight of Roberto's story settled over the assembled guests. Marcus felt something shift inside his chest, an uncomfortable recognition of his own assumptions and prejudices. Here was a man who had sacrificed his career, his artistic identity, everything that gave his life meaning, for love and hope. Instead of recognition, he had found only indifference and, in Marcus's case, active contempt. "How long have you been working here?" asked Mr. Chen, another of Marcus's major investors, his tone gentle with newfound respect. 3 years next month," Roberto replied. "Mr. Sterling's building has good benefits, and the night shift allows me to avoid the crowds that sometimes make me feel self-conscious about my situation. It is honest work, and there is dignity in all honest work." Marcus cringed at the indirect reference to his earlier cruelty, remembering how he had used Roberto's job as a weapon to diminish him. The man's grace in the face of such treatment only made Marcus's behavior seem more shameful in retrospect. He had attacked someone whose character and accomplishments far exceeded his own, motivated by nothing more than class prejudice and social insecurity. The questions continued for another 20 minutes, with Marcus's guests treating Roberto as they would any accomplished artist they might encounter at a gallery opening or cultural event. They discussed musical theory, performance techniques, and the emotional interpretation of various composers with a level of sophistication that left Marcus feeling excluded from his own event. Finally, Dr. Blackwell made an observation that would haunt Marcus for weeks to come. "Roberto, your talent is extraordinary, but what strikes me most is your resilience. To maintain such artistry while enduring personal loss and professional displacement requires a strength of spirit that is genuinely rare. You honor both your gift and your circumstances with remarkable grace." Roberto's eyes glistened with unshed tears at the recognition, the first time in 3 years that anyone had acknowledged not just his talent, but his humanity. "Thank you, Doctor. Music has been my companion through the darkest times. Even when I could not perform for others, I could still play for her memory, for the dreams we once shared." As the evening wound down and the guests reluctantly began to leave, many of them approached Roberto personally to express their admiration and gratitude. Marcus watched this unprecedented social interaction with growing unease, realizing that his attempt to maintain rigid class boundaries had backfired spectacularly. Instead of reinforcing his authority, the evening had revealed the arbitrary nature of the social hierarchies he had taken for granted. Mrs. Pemberton was the last to speak with Roberto, and her words carried particular weight given her standing in the city's cultural community. "Roberto, I sit on the board of the Metropolitan Arts Center. We're always looking for exceptional talent to showcase. Would you be interested in discussing a possible recital? Your story and your artistry deserve a much wider audience." The offer hung in the air like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. Roberto's face showed a mixture of hope and disbelief, as if he couldn't quite trust that such an opportunity was being offered. "Mrs. Pemberton, I would be deeply honored by such consideration. Music has been silent in my life for too long, except for stolen moments like tonight." "Wonderful," she replied, pressing her business card into his hand. "Call me tomorrow, and we'll discuss the details. The world needs to hear music like yours, Roberto. It reminds us of what truly matters in life." As the last guests departed, Marcus found himself alone with Roberto in the conference room. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken words, years of assumptions that had been shattered in a single evening. Marcus studied the man he had so thoroughly misjudged, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time since they had worked in the same building. "Roberto," Marcus began, his voice uncertain and stripped of its usual authority. "I owe you an apology. What I said before, the way I treated you, it was inexcusable. I made assumptions about you based on your job, your appearance, things that have nothing to do with who you really are." Roberto looked at him with eyes that held no anger, only a weary understanding of human nature's complexities. "Mr. Sterling, we all make judgments based on what we can see. Tonight you saw something different, something that was always there but hidden beneath circumstances beyond my control. Your guests saw it too, and their kindness has given me hope I had not felt in many years." The grace of Roberto's response only deepened Marcus's shame. Here was a man who had every right to be bitter, to demand apologies and acknowledgments, yet he chose understanding and forgiveness instead. The contrast between Roberto's character and Marcus's own behavior was stark and humbling. "Is there anything I can do?" Marcus asked, the question surprising him with its sincerity. "To make up for how I've treated you? To help with your music career?" Roberto smiled, the first genuine smile Marcus had ever seen from him. "You have already done more than you know, Mr. Sterling. By allowing me to play tonight, by letting your guests hear my music, you have given me back a part of myself I thought was lost forever. Sometimes the greatest gifts come from the most unexpected sources." As Roberto gathered his cleaning supplies to continue his work, Marcus remained in the conference room, staring at the piano that had served as the catalyst for his uncomfortable awakening. The instrument his father had treasured as a symbol of cultural refinement had become something far more important, a bridge between two men whose lives had intersected in ways that challenged everything Marcus thought he understood about success, worth, and human dignity. The evening had begun as a carefully orchestrated business event designed to reinforce Marcus's position at the top of his social and professional hierarchy. It had ended with the revelation that true artistry, genuine accomplishment, and authentic human value existed in places he had never bothered to look, worn by people he had dismissed without consideration. As Marcus finally left the building that night, Roberto's music still echoing in his memory, he carried with him the uncomfortable knowledge that his worldview had been built on foundations of sand. The man he had mocked and dismissed possessed talents that Marcus could never acquire, had overcome challenges that Marcus had never faced, and had maintained a dignity and grace under pressure that Marcus now realized he himself had never been tested to display. The city's lights stretched out below as Marcus walked to his car, each gleaming window representing lives and stories he had never considered worth knowing. For the first time in his adult life, Marcus Sterling began to question not just his assumptions about others, but his understanding of what it truly meant to be successful, valuable, and worthy of respect in a world far more complex and beautiful than his privilege had ever allowed him to see. The weeks following Roberto's performance passed in a haze of conflicted emotions for Marcus Sterling. Every morning as he arrived at Sterling Financial Tower, he found himself listening for the sound of piano music that had once filled him with indignation, but now stirred something far more complex within his chest. The building felt different somehow, as if Roberto's revelations had shifted the very foundations of what Marcus thought he understood about the world around him. The change wasn't just internal. Word of Roberto's extraordinary performance had spread through the city's cultural circles with remarkable speed. Aided by Mrs. Pemberton's influential connections and Dr. Blackwell's enthusiastic recommendations, Marcus began receiving calls from board members, clients, and social acquaintances, all wanting to know more about the mysterious janitor who possessed such remarkable talent. Each conversation left Marcus feeling more uncomfortable, as if he were being forced to confront the shallow assumptions that had guided his interactions with people for decades. 3 weeks after the dinner, Marcus arrived at his office to find an unusual scene unfolding in the lobby. A small crowd had gathered around the information desk, their voices animated with excitement and anticipation. As Marcus approached, he recognized several faces from the city's arts community, people he knew only peripherally from charity events and cultural fundraisers. At the center of their attention stood Roberto, no longer wearing his janitorial uniform but dressed in a simple black suit that somehow transformed his entire presence. "Mr. Sterling," called out Margaret Hoffman, a prominent arts patron whose family foundation supported several local orchestras. "How wonderful to see you. We were just discussing Roberto's upcoming recital at the Metropolitan Arts Center. I understand we have you to thank for bringing his talent to light." Marcus felt heat rise to his face as the group turned toward him with expressions of gratitude and admiration that he knew he didn't deserve. The irony of being credited with discovering Roberto's talent when he had actually tried to suppress it was almost overwhelming. "I can't take credit for Roberto's abilities," he managed to say, his voice strained with discomfort. "His talent speaks for itself." Roberto's eyes met his across the crowd, and Marcus saw something there that made his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite identify. It wasn't anger or resentment as Marcus might have expected, but rather a kind of gentle understanding that somehow made Marcus feel even worse about his past behavior. The man's capacity for forgiveness seemed as extraordinary as his musical abilities. "The recital is tomorrow evening," Roberto said, addressing the group but keeping his gaze on Marcus. "Mrs. Pemberton has been incredibly generous with her support, and the Metropolitan Arts Center has provided a beautiful venue. It will be my first public performance in over 4 years." His voice carried a mixture of excitement and nervousness that reminded Marcus that beneath Roberto's remarkable composure lay a human being who had endured tremendous loss and was now taking a tremendous risk by stepping back into the world that had once defined his identity. Dr. Blackwell stepped forward, his enthusiasm evident in every gesture. "Roberto, I've told everyone I know about your performance. The neurological precision required for that level of technical mastery, combined with the emotional depth of your interpretation, it's simply remarkable. You're going to captivate the audience tomorrow night." As the conversation continued around him, Marcus found himself studying Roberto with new eyes. Gone was the apologetic posture of the man he had encountered 3 weeks ago. In its place stood someone who carried himself with quiet confidence, someone who had reclaimed a part of his identity that had been dormant for too long. The transformation was subtle but profound, as if Roberto had remembered not just his musical abilities but his fundamental worth as a human being. The crowd began to disperse as people returned to their various commitments, leaving Marcus alone with Roberto in the marble expanse of the lobby. The silence between them stretched uncomfortably, filled with unspoken words and unresolved tensions that Marcus didn't know how to address. He had spent weeks thinking about what he might say to Roberto, how he might begin to make amends for his cruel dismissal of the man's dignity and worth. "Roberto," Marcus began, his voice rougher than he intended, "about tomorrow night, I hope it goes well for you. You deserve this opportunity, and much more." The words felt inadequate, barely scratching the surface of what Marcus wanted to convey but seemed incapable of expressing with any eloquence. Roberto studied him for a moment, his dark eyes thoughtful and penetrating. "Mr. Sterling, would you consider attending the recital tomorrow evening? Your presence would mean a great deal to me, given our history and the role you played in making this possible." The invitation was extended with such genuine sincerity that Marcus felt his throat constrict with emotion. "You want me there?" Marcus asked, unable to hide his surprise. "After the way I treated you, the things I said?" A small smile played at the corners of Roberto's mouth, an expression that held more wisdom than Marcus had accumulated in his 42 years of privilege and success. "Music has taught me that harmony often emerges from discord, Mr. Sterling. Sometimes the most beautiful compositions arise from the resolution of conflicting themes. Tomorrow night represents a new movement in my life's symphony, and I would be honored to have you witness it." The metaphor wasn't lost on Marcus, who recognized in Roberto's words an invitation to participate in something far more significant than a simple musical performance. This was an opportunity for redemption, for growth, for the kind of human connection that Marcus had been avoiding his entire adult life. The prospect terrified and intrigued him in equal measure. "I'll be there," Marcus heard himself say, the commitment feeling both natural and revolutionary. "Thank you for the invitation, Roberto. I know I don't deserve your generosity, but I'm grateful for it nonetheless." Roberto nodded once, a gesture that seemed to close one chapter of their relationship while opening another. "Forgiveness is not about deserving, Mr. Sterling. It is about choosing to move forward rather than remaining trapped by the past. Tomorrow night, we both have the opportunity to discover who we might become." The following evening found Marcus standing outside the Metropolitan Arts Center, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his tie for the third time in as many minutes. The building buzzed with activity as elegantly dressed patrons made their way through the ornate entrance, their conversations filled with anticipation for the evening's performance. Marcus recognized many faces from the city's cultural elite, people whose opinions carried significant weight in determining an artist's success or failure. Inside the concert hall, Marcus was surprised to discover that every seat appeared to be occupied. Word of Roberto's extraordinary talent had clearly spread far beyond the small group who had witnessed his performance at Sterling Financial Tower. The audience represented a cross-section of the city's musical community, from conservatory students to seasoned critics, all drawn by reports of the janitor-turned-virtuoso who had captured the imagination of everyone who had heard him play. Marcus found his seat in the third row, close enough to observe every detail of Roberto's performance, but far enough back to feel somewhat anonymous among the crowd. As he settled into the plush velvet chair, Marcus couldn't help but reflect on the surreal nature of the situation. 3 weeks ago, he had been berating Roberto for touching his piano. Tonight, he was attending the man's professional debut at one of the city's most prestigious venues. The lights dimmed gradually, and a hush fell over the assembled audience as Roberto walked onto the stage. He moved with the measured grace of someone completely comfortable in his own skin, no trace of the nervous janitor Marcus had first encountered. Roberto wore the same simple black suit Marcus had seen him in that morning, but somehow it seemed transformed by the stage lights into something elegant and appropriate for the magnificent venue. Roberto approached the concert grand piano positioned at center stage, an instrument that dwarfed even Marcus's expensive Steinway in both size and grandeur. He paused beside the bench for a moment, his hands resting lightly on the piano's polished surface, as if greeting an old friend he hadn't seen in far too long. The gesture was intimate and reverent, speaking to a relationship with music that transcended mere technical proficiency. When Roberto finally sat down and placed his hands above the keys, the entire concert hall seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. Marcus found himself leaning forward despite his attempt to maintain emotional distance, drawn in by the palpable sense of expectation that filled the air around them. Whatever was about to happen, everyone in the room sensed that they were about to witness something extraordinary. The first notes of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor filled the concert hall with crystalline clarity, each sound precisely articulated yet flowing seamlessly into the next. Marcus had heard this piece performed many times before by world-renowned pianists, but Roberto's interpretation brought something fresh and deeply personal to the familiar composition. The music seemed to emerge not just from his fingers, but from some deeper place within his soul, each phrase shaped by years of joy and sorrow, triumph and loss. As the piece progressed, Marcus found himself completely transported by the performance unfolding before him. Roberto's technique was flawless, his fingers dancing across the keys with the precision of a master craftsman and the passion of a poet. But beyond the technical excellence lay something far more profound, an emotional honesty that transformed the concert hall into a space of shared human experience. The audience was utterly silent, hanging on every note as Roberto wove his musical narrative. Marcus could see faces around him reflecting the same awe and emotion that he felt, building in his own chest. This wasn't simply a piano recital. It was a masterclass in the power of art, to transcend circumstances, to transform pain into beauty, to create connections between strangers through the universal language of music. When the first piece concluded, the applause was immediate and thunderous, lasting for several minutes as the audience expressed their appreciation for what they had just experienced. Roberto acknowledged their enthusiasm with a modest bow, his face showing a mixture of gratitude and joy that Marcus found deeply moving. This was a man reclaiming his rightful place in the world, stepping back into the light after years of being invisible. The second piece Roberto chose was Rachmaninoff's Piano Sonata No. 2, a work of staggering complexity that would challenge even the most accomplished virtuoso. As Roberto began the opening movement, Marcus realized he was witnessing something truly special, not just a performance, but a musical conversation between the composer's intentions and Roberto's lived experience. Every passage seemed infused with personal meaning, every dynamic shift carefully chosen to convey emotional truth rather than mere technical display. The Rachmaninoff Sonata revealed new depths of Roberto's artistry, demonstrating not only his technical mastery but his profound understanding of musical structure and emotional architecture. Marcus found himself thinking about the sacrifices Roberto had made, the dreams he had set aside, the years of silence that had preceded this moment of triumphant return. The music seemed to tell that story without words, speaking directly to the hearts of everyone who listened. During the brief intermission, Marcus overheard conversations throughout the lobby that confirmed what he was feeling. This was a performance that would be remembered and discussed for years to come. Critics were already comparing Roberto to legendary pianists, while music students spoke in hushed, reverent tones about the emotional power of his interpretation. Marcus felt a strange mixture of pride and shame, proud to have played a role in bringing Roberto's talent to light, while simultaneously ashamed of how close he had come to silencing it forever. The second half of the recital featured a selection of pieces that showcased different aspects of Roberto's musical personality. Debussy's Clair de Lune revealed his delicate touch and impressionistic sensibilities, while Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2 inches demonstrated his technical prowess and dramatic flair. Each piece was performed with such conviction and artistry that Marcus began to understand why Mrs. Pemberton and the other arts patrons had been so eager to support Roberto's return to performance. But it was Roberto's final selection that truly stunned both Marcus and the entire audience. Instead of choosing another classical masterpiece, Roberto had composed an original piece, a musical autobiography that traced his journey from the conservatory in Buenos Aires to the concert halls of his dreams, through the darkness of loss and displacement, and finally to this moment of redemption and renewal. The composition was hauntingly beautiful, incorporating elements of tango from his homeland, classical structures from his training, and emotional depths that could only come from lived experience. As Roberto played his own composition, Marcus felt tears streaming down his face for the first time in years. The music told a story of resilience, of love that transcends death, of dreams that refuse to die even in the face of overwhelming circumstances. It was a piece that could only have been written by someone who had lost everything and found the strength to begin again, someone who understood that true art emerges not from comfort, but from the crucible of human experience. When the final notes faded into silence, the audience remained motionless for several heartbeats, as if afraid that any sound might diminish the profound impact of what they had just witnessed. Then, slowly, people began to rise from their seats, the applause building gradually until the entire concert hall erupted in a standing ovation that lasted for nearly 10 minutes. Flowers appeared on stage, thrown by admirers who had been moved beyond words by Roberto's performance. Roberto stood beside the piano, tears glistening in his eyes as he acknowledged the overwhelming response to his music. Marcus could see the man's hands trembling slightly, not from nervousness but from the emotional intensity of the moment. This was vindication, recognition, and redemption, all rolled into a single transformative experience. As the applause finally began to subside, Roberto raised his hands for silence. His voice, when he spoke, was clear and strong, carrying easily throughout the hushed concert hall. Thank you for this extraordinary gift of your attention and appreciation. Tonight, I have been reminded that music is not something we own, but something we share. Not a possession, but a bridge that connects us to each other and to the deepest truths of human experience. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the audience until it found Marcus in the third row. I want to thank someone who made this evening possible in ways he may not fully understand. Sometimes our greatest teachers are those who challenge us to remember who we truly are, even when their methods are not what we might choose. Mr. Marcus Sterling, your building has been my home for 3 years, and your piano has been my companion during the darkest hours. Thank you for allowing me to rediscover my voice. The acknowledgement hit Marcus like a physical blow, drawing the attention of hundreds of people to his location in the audience. He felt exposed and vulnerable, but also strangely honored to be recognized by someone whose character and artistry he had come to deeply respect. The applause that followed Roberto's words seemed to include Marcus in its warmth, as if the audience understood that redemption stories require catalysts, even reluctant ones. After the formal conclusion of the recital, Marcus made his way backstage, driven by a need to speak with Roberto privately about what had just transpired. The backstage area buzzed with activity as critics, arts patrons, and music lovers crowded around Roberto, each wanting to express their admiration and discuss future opportunities. Marcus waited patiently on the periphery, watching as Roberto graciously received praise and fielded offers with the poise of someone born to perform on stages like this. Mrs. Pemberton was among those surrounding Roberto, her face glowing with satisfaction at the success of her protégé's debut. "Roberto, this has exceeded every expectation," she was saying as Marcus approached. "The Steinberg Foundation wants to discuss a recording contract, and I've had inquiries from 3 different orchestras about possible collaborations. Your career is about to take off in ways you never imagined." Roberto's response was characteristically gracious and thoughtful. "Mrs. Pemberton, I am overwhelmed by your generosity and the opportunities you have created for me. This evening has given me back something I thought was lost forever. Whatever comes next, I will always be grateful for your faith in my abilities." When Roberto finally noticed Marcus approaching, he excused himself from the group and walked over with a smile that seemed to hold no trace of their difficult history. "Mr. Sterling, I'm so glad you came tonight. What did you think of the performance?" Marcus struggled to find words adequate to express what he had experienced. "Roberto, I don't have the vocabulary to describe what I just witnessed. Your music tonight, it was transformative. I'm not sure I'm the same person who walked into this concert hall 3 hours ago." The admission felt raw and vulnerable, but also necessary. Roberto's expression softened with understanding. Music has that power, doesn't it? It forces us to confront truths about ourselves and our world that we might prefer to avoid. Tonight was healing for me in ways I didn't expect. I hope it was meaningful for you as well. They were interrupted by the arrival of a distinguished-looking man in his 60s, impeccably dressed, and carrying himself with the authority of someone accustomed to being recognized. Marcus immediately identified him as Victor Steinberg, one of the city's most influential arts patrons, and the heir to a classical music dynasty that had shaped the cultural landscape for generations. "Roberto," Steinberg said, extending his hand with obvious respect. "That was one of the most moving performances I've witnessed in 40 years of attending concerts. Your original composition, in particular, was absolutely stunning. I'd like to discuss the possibility of commissioning a full album of your original works, with full orchestral arrangements and international distribution." The offer represented the kind of opportunity that most classical musicians could only dream of achieving. The sort of career-defining moment that could transform Roberto from a local curiosity into an internationally recognized artist. Marcus watched Roberto's face carefully, looking for signs of the excitement and ambition that such an offer would typically generate. Instead, Roberto's response revealed the depth of character that had impressed Marcus from their first real conversation. "Mr. Steinberg, I am deeply honored by your interest in my music. The opportunity to share my compositions with a wider audience is something I had never dared to imagine. However, I hope you'll understand that I need some time to consider what this might mean for my life and my responsibilities." Steinberg looked surprised by Roberto's measured response, clearly expecting the immediate acceptance that usually accompanied such generous offers. "Of course, take all the time you need. But I hope you'll remember that opportunities like this don't come along often, especially for artists who are starting their careers later in life." After Steinberg moved away to speak with other members of Roberto's growing circle of admirers, Marcus found himself alone with Roberto again. The weight of the evening's revelations hung between them, along with the recognition that their relationship had been fundamentally altered by what had transpired. "You're not going to take his offer immediately," Marcus observed, more as a statement than a question. Roberto smiled, his expression thoughtful and slightly sad. 3 years ago, I would have accepted without hesitation, but loss teaches you to value different things, Mr. Sterling. Success, recognition, career advancement, they matter, but they're not the only things that matter. I've learned to find meaning in smaller moments, in unexpected connections, in the simple act of creating beauty, even when no one is listening." The words carried a rebuke that Marcus felt deeply, a reminder of how focused he had become on external measures of success at the expense of more fundamental human values. Roberto's willingness to consider turning down a life-changing opportunity because it might compromise other priorities revealed a wisdom that Marcus realized he had never developed. "What will you do?" Marcus asked, genuinely curious about Roberto's thought process. Roberto was quiet for a moment, considering his answer carefully. "I will continue to play, to compose, to share music with anyone who wants to listen. Whether that happens on international stages or in empty office buildings at midnight, the music itself remains the same." Tonight reminded me that the greatest gift is not applause, but the opportunity to touch another person's heart through art. As the backstage crowd began to thin and Roberto prepared to leave, Marcus found himself facing a moment of decision that felt as significant as any business choice he had ever made. The old Marcus would have returned to his comfortable world of financial statements and investment strategies, filing away the evening's experiences as an interesting anomaly that had little bearing on his real life. But something fundamental had shifted during Roberto's performance, something that made returning to his previous way of living seem not just impossible but morally insufficient. Marcus had witnessed the power of authentic artistry to transform both performer and audience, had seen how human connection could emerge from the most unlikely circumstances, had experienced firsthand the difference between surface-level success and genuine accomplishment. "Roberto," Marcus said as the musician gathered his few belongings, "I want to do something to support your music, not as charity but as an investment in something meaningful. The Blackwood Foundation that my father established. We've never focused on the arts, but I think it's time that changed." Roberto looked at him with surprise and something that might have been hope. "Mr. Sterling, you don't need to feel obligated to help me because of what happened between us. Tonight's performance has already given me more than I dared to dream." Marcus shook his head, his decision crystallizing as he spoke. "This isn't about obligation, Roberto. It's about recognition. I've spent my entire career funding things that generate profit, but I've never invested in anything that generates the kind of value you created tonight. I want to establish a program that supports artists like you, people whose circumstances have prevented them from sharing their gifts with the world." The idea was taking shape even as Marcus articulated it, driven by a vision of using his resources to create opportunities rather than simply accumulate wealth. For the first time in years, Marcus felt energized by a project that promised to create something beautiful rather than merely profitable. Roberto's eyes filled with tears as he grasped the implications of Marcus's offer. "Such a program could change lives, Mr. Sterling. There are so many talented people whose stories are similar to mine, whose gifts remain hidden because circumstances have pushed them to the margins of society." "Then let's find them," Marcus said, feeling more certain about this decision than he had about anything in years. "Let's create something that honors both artistic excellence and human resilience. Your performance tonight proved that talent exists in places we never think to look, among people we too often choose to ignore." As they walked out of the Metropolitan Arts Center together, Marcus reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. 3 weeks ago, he had been a successful but isolated man whose primary concerns were profit margins and social status. Tonight, he was embarking on a partnership with someone he had once dismissed, united by a shared vision of using privilege and resources to amplify voices that might otherwise remain unheard. The city streets outside the concert hall were quieter than usual, as if the world itself had been transformed by the evening's music. Marcus felt different walking these familiar sidewalks, more aware of the lives and stories hidden behind every window, more conscious of his responsibility to use his advantages for purposes beyond personal gain. "Roberto," Marcus said as they reached the intersection where their paths would diverge, "thank you for tonight, for your music, for your forgiveness, for showing me what's possible when we look beyond our assumptions about people." Roberto smiled, his face peaceful and content in a way that Marcus envied. "Thank you for listening, Mr. Sterling, both to my music and to the possibilities it represents. Sometimes the most beautiful harmonies emerge from the most discordant beginnings." As Marcus watched Roberto disappear into the night, he carried with him the echo of extraordinary music and the promise of extraordinary change. The janitor who had once seemed like an intrusion in his carefully ordered world had become the catalyst for a transformation that would ripple through Marcus's life in ways he was only beginning to understand. The following Monday, Marcus arrived at Sterling Financial Tower with a sense of purpose that felt entirely new. Instead of heading directly to his executive office, he made his way to the Human Resources Department to begin researching the backgrounds and circumstances of every employee in the building. If Roberto's story had taught him anything, it was that extraordinary people often lived extraordinary lives in plain sight, waiting for someone to notice their hidden gifts and untold potential. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.